I will try to speak up. My voice will drift off because this is not my usual way of speaking. So if it does, raise your hand and I will try to recover. My name is Michael Perlman. I teach at California State University, and I'm happy to be a friend of our other two panelists, David McNally and Michael Hudson. I was primed for this talk because about a year ago, I was privileged to be in a meeting with Michael Hudson, where we stayed in Turkey, right across from Taksim Park. Then I got to go to another conference with with David McNally, and there we were at a conference in Slovenia, which is now on the cutting edge of the austerity program, cutting through all of Europe. It's the latest on the chopping block. On the plane here, I realized that the talk I had written for today is very different from what I'm going to speak about. I'm going to talk about primitive accumulation from the standpoint of what economists have never understood about primitive accumulation. So I start with Adam Smith. Adam Smith is a very interesting example who studiously avoided anything dealing with problems in capitalism. His most famous description is of a very small pin factory that all of you have heard about. What you might not realize is that it was a pack of lies, setting a standard that economists have followed scrupulously. First of all, the pin factory was located in Adam Smith's neighborhood, supposedly. What he didn't mention was that the Industrial Revolution began in the little village where he lived. The largest industrial factory in the world was making the cannons that allowed the British Navy to conquer large parts of the world. You never hear about that. In the pin factory, there's a little reference to nail workers. And the nail workers, he said, are very agile, very dexterous. Well, who were these nail workers? They were considered orphans, but more likely they were the children of people whose family had been displaced from the land by primitive accumulation. The factory, which made cannons, had excess metal, so they paid the nail workers from all around England and Scotland to relocate to Kirkcaldy, Smith's home village. And the company, the Cairn Works, made deals with the orphanages to supply these children who were like slaves working for them. But they were very dexterous. That's all Adam Smith tells us about. Now, interestingly enough, although Adam Smith was a very, very distinguished philosopher, and his book on moral sentiments was very popular, his books on his main book, The Wealth of Nations, was ignored. No one paid attention to it. At Cambridge University, in one of the libraries, by 1789, the copy had been checked out 3 times. But 1789, what happened? French Revolution. And suddenly, the importance of Smith was recognized. Here is an answer to all of these people calling for revolution, for equity, or more particularly, for liberty, equality, and fraternity. Francis Horner was perhaps, with the exception of Ricardo, the leading economic thinker in the Parliament. He was asked to do a new edition of The Wealth of Nations. He declined. His reason was, if I were to do a new edition, I would have to point out all of his mistakes. I would not want to do this until the book's work is done. So now the work's done, and nobody still has pointed out all of his mistakes. For example, he tells you in the pin factory, he said, if a worker were to produce pins on his own, he could produce only a few pins a day. But in the pin factory, he can produce many, many, many pins. Except what he didn't say was, first of all, he was plagiarizing all of the data and all of the information from an unacknowledged French article, and then he didn't tell you that his figures based on the individual worker was on the assumption that the individual worker had to dig up the ore, smelt the ore, pull it into wires, and then make the pin. So it was almost as if, when you go to the supermarket next time, you should applaud the checkout person who's able to feed many, many more people than an individual farmer. Okay, so that's Adam Smith. Now, at the same time, in the same village, there was another economist named Sir James Stewart, smarter, deeper, and unacknowledged. And he was not acknowledged because when he was writing about the market, and he was very conservative.
Yes.
Sir James Stewart.
S-T-E-U-A-R-T.
And at one point in his book, he made the mistake of saying, you know, in the market, well, first of all, he was talking about how good Sparta was and how it would be good if we could emulate Sparta. But he says, no, we couldn't get slavery anymore. But we can get the same thing from the market. Boom, there goes his book. And later in life, he said, if I were to write a biography of my poor departed dog, it would have been 3 times as long and many times more read. Okay? So here we get the idea of you want to hold things down. At the time, what was going on was the displacement of workers from the land. None of the economists acknowledged it. Smith said, oh, that's a bunch of aristocrats. Nobody else even mentioned it, except James Stewart and a few pamphleteers. And Stewart said, you have to be careful kicking the people off the land. He said, a horse has to be caressed before it is put a bridle on. And he said, you have to be careful to make sure that you have adequate demand for the workers before you kick them off the land, as you have to do this scientifically. And he's much better than Adam Smith. Now, what's interesting is none of the economists talked about primitive accumulation in any of their writing. And yet, these same economists, time and again, in their private papers, in their letters, would applaud it. Because they wanted to talk about the market as a system of voluntary relations. Just what Adam Smith was saying.
Voluntary what?
Relationship.
Relationship.
Ricardo, David Ricardo, perhaps the smartest economist who ever wrote, argued, for example, that the problem in Ireland was that food was too cheap. And if we're going to get the Irish economy to work the way we want it, we have to make food more difficult to get. The problem with Ireland was underpopulation, because if they had more people, then they'd have more poverty, and then they'd have more wage workers. This is the world that these people lived in. So the economists are supporting it. And now we're seeing another wave of primitive accumulation. Marx even said that public debt is a lever of primitive accumulation.
A river.
A lever.
Your voice goes
Lever.
down.
Could you use the mic?
Use the mic.
Public
Please.
debt.
Could you please use
Those
the
are
mic?
not mics.
It's recording, it's recording.
Try to lower your voice a little bit.
When you make your points, go up instead of down.
Mike, check.
I've never run for public office.
Try it.
Yeah, but teach.
How do your students hear you?
Teach.
Pardon?
How do your students hear you?
Considerable difficulty.
I go up and I whisper in their ears. I whisper in their ears.
Only intimate seminars.
Okay, public debt is a lever of primitive accumulation. And yeah, tell me if I drift down. Okay. Now, the difference between modern primitive accumulation and primitive accumulation, classical political accumulation, classical primitive accumulation, is that classical primitive accumulation was occurring at a time of great optimism. There were new opportunities. At first, aristocrats, landowners realized that if they kicked the people off the land, people who had not private property, but they had hereditary rights to the land, they could kick them off the land, they wouldn't have to feed them, they could keep a few of them, they could raise sheep, they could sell the wool in Europe, and make much more surplus than they could if they were to continue doing conventional agriculture. So here was a new opportunity, and primitive accumulation was a way of trying to take advantage of these new opportunities. Today, the opportunities of capitalism are becoming smaller and smaller. We had two great opportunities. One was the opening up of Eastern Europe and then China. And those have not proved as profitable as was expected. And then was the dot-com boom.
The what?
Dot-com boom. The internet boom in the late 1990s. But even so, profits have been under attack. And the attack has gone on since the late 1960s. That is, we had a post-war boom. And the boom occurred for a curious reason. It occurred because of destructiveness. First of all, destructiveness. First of all, the war destroyed many of our competitors, and the Depression destroyed a great deal of excess capital. And during the Depression, what you saw was intense competition that forced the scrapping of many factories, creating a shortage that allowed for greater profitability. We see this today in the airline industry. Airlines are profitable. Why? Where do most of the airlines fly most of their planes? In the desert. By removing the planes from the airports to the desert, they can pack in all of their flights and they can make a great profit. So you had this particular unique period called the Golden Age. Profits go up, everyone's happy. By the late 1960s, profits are starting to stagnate. And all of a sudden, the U.S. went into a dramatic shift into right-wing activism, funded by huge contributions, beginning with the Coors family. Then you get people like the Koch brothers, and you had a whole network of right-wing activism. that was able to turn the economy around to make it possible to create a kind of primitive accumulation, not by taking away private property, but by taking away public property. Right now, the latest form of public property being confiscated is the pension. Pensions are terrible. Governments have overcommitted. Corporations are overcommitted. Have any of you heard of Patriot Coal?
What?
Patriot Coal Company. Coal.
Patriot Coal.
Patriot Coal was a company created when Peabody Oil split off all of its unprofitable coal mines and then credited Patriot Coal with all of the pension and medical care that the company was supposed to take care of. And just recently, the courts just said, that's okay.
It's okay, they approved.
Pardon?
They approved.
They approved it. You're seeing pensions being cut everywhere, corporate pensions, government pensions, and the bond market rewards those states that cut their pensions and punishes those that are willing to honor their obligations. At the same time, bondholders' obligations are sacred, and nothing can challenge them. Now, part of the problem that capitalism suffered and continues to suffer, and has continued to suffer in the United States from the late 1870s, is the problem of over-competition. Over-competition means that in a modern economy, in the particular kind of over-competition I want to discuss, in a modern economy, the price of producing one more unit is very small. Whether it's a pharmaceutical pill, whether it's a recorded music, or whether it's a seat in an airplane. That is, it doesn't cost much to carry me from California to New York if there's an empty seat. And what we know from our beginning economics is that prices go down to what's called the marginal cost, the cost of producing one more. And the United States first realized this during the late 19th century when the railroads were coming online. And the railroads were competing with each other. And the prices were going down. And they were going bankrupt. In The Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, Scrooge's first nightmare, what was it? He had bought bonds in American railroads. That was so terrible, a nightmare. What had happened? The railroads would compete with each other, they couldn't pay off their bonds, and the railroad represented 2/3 of the capital stock of the United States. The stock market itself was trivial and insignificant until railroad paper started moving. Am I talking too softly again? Okay. Well, you help me. You know, stand up and do something. Okay. So here's the deal with the railroad. Prices would go down to the marginal cost. If they only got the marginal cost, they couldn't pay off the bonds. And the man who represented Scrooge and the other bondholders was a familiar name, J.P. Morgan. Actually, it was his father, Junius Morgan. But J.P. Morgan took over from the father. And he would tell the railroads, you guys are crazy, don't compete. And they would all agree not to compete. And then someone would cheat. The agreement would fall apart, and the railroads would go bankrupt again. Not just the railroad, but all sorts of companies. So Morgan started Morganizing the economy, leading a great consolidation. And the consolidation was one in which Morgan would take over a company, or another financier would take over a company, lump them all together, reduce competition, and could raise prices. He did it with the railroads. He did it with United States Steel. I think the United States Steel, the cost of the takeover was something like 1% of the gross domestic product of the United States. Maybe more. I'm not good with numbers. So what happened was, in the late 1870s, there was this Great Depression. That was the Great Depression, 1870. Later, there was a new Great Depression. Now we only have a modest recession. But in this Great Depression, it lasted from the 1870s, 1871, until the 1890s. And finally, Teddy Roosevelt got us out of the war. He was only Undersecretary of the Navy, but he got the Spanish-American War started, and that got America booming again and ended the Depression. However, one of the ironies of competition, or of economics, is you need competition to create progress, to create innovation, and yet competition is destructive. A depression is nothing else more than a strong competition, a wave of strong competition. So what you got after 1870s and after 1890s, then you got a less vibrant economy until the discovery of electrical motors, and then you got a burst in the 20s and then down again. Capitalism doesn't work. Because it doesn't work, you see the emergence of an almost entirely parasitic capitalist system, looking everywhere, looking for new forms of primitive accumulation, whether in Taksim Square, whether in Slovenia, whether in the United States. Primitive accumulation, primitive accumulation, primitive accumulation. Okay, now you get to hear two speakers who will speak more loudly. The first speaker is David McNally from York University. Listen, I don't have to introduce these people. Everybody knows you and you.
I'm David McNally from York University. I want to thank the Union for Radical Political Economics for sponsoring this forum. And really what I want to do in my remarks is look at the role of ongoing primitive accumulation today in generating the massive growth of a global reserve army of labor, which I argue is crucial to understanding not only the neoliberal era, but the moment, the age of austerity that was introduced with the global slump beginning in 2008. And of course it's true that primitive accumulation, or various synonyms for it, such as David Harvey's accumulation by dispossession, has been in the air for some time now, and one can see why. We are witnessing an accelerated wave of land grabs, particularly in the global south, between 2000 and 2010. About 200 million hectares of land have been bought up in developing countries. For instance, that's because some of you will know Canada is a big country geographically. That's about 3 times the arable land that Canada has. 2/3 of these land grabs are in Africa. So we're seeing this accelerated process of seizing land in one form or another. And this can sometimes be for water, it can be for ecotourism, it can be for mineral and oil and gas exploration, it can be for industrial development, as much of it is in India and China, for instance. It can be the capitalization on so-called natural disasters, as happened in Honduras after Hurricane Mitch in 1998, or of course, as many of you know, happened in Louisiana after Katrina. And of course, it can also involve civil wars, where we often think of civil wars as being primarily ethnic conflicts. Many commentators in recent years have pointed out that the so-called ethnic conflicts are more often than not covers for displacement. They are the ethnicization, in other words, of attempts to displace people. So that as one economist in Colombia has put it, talking about the so-called wars in Colombia, there is war so there might be displacement. There is not displacement because there is war. In other words, war, militarized violence as an instrument of displacement. And all of this resonates powerfully with Marx's discussion of primitive accumulation in Part 8 of Volume 1 of Capital. And there Marx is interested in the double-sidedness of the process. On the one hand, dispossession, but on the other side, integrally connected to it, the flip side of it, the constitution of a proletariat, the expansion of a proletariat, including the reserve army of labor. In my view, Marx didn't fully appreciate just how radical and powerful this argument was in his own text. And I think one of the reasons for that is that he developed in chapter 25 of Capital an account of what he called the capitalist law of population, which he believed would explain the internal generation of an industrial reserve army. And basically Marx's argument goes like this. When capital mechanizes, it displaces labor. In so doing, it regularly constitutes and reconstitutes a reserve army of labor. Now, that was a very, very good argument for the time. The problem is, it assumes a given birth rate. It assumes that the proletariat will keep reproducing itself at the same birth rate as it was in the 19th century. And of course, one of the things we know, and to which Marx didn't pay any attention, is that working class women in Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and elsewhere, as the 19th century wore on and as we turned into the 20th century, increasingly regulated their own reproduction and in so doing reduced family sizes. This aspect of women's control over their own fertility and reproduction is absent in Marx's account, in part because he tends to treat reproduction of human beings as a natural process. He's insufficiently social in understanding its social regulation, in this case by working class women. As I say, Marx's analysis fit the facts empirically of the time. If you look at the century prior to the First World War, for instance, 50 million people left Europe. And so the idea that huge numbers were being displaced, that there was emigration, not net immigration into Europe, was historically accurate. But as family size for the working class in Europe declines, what we've seen is that the countries at the core of the global capitalist system have become net importers of labor, not net exporters. So much so, in fact, that there would be dramatic drops in the size of the population, therefore in the size of the working class, and therefore the drying up of the industrial reserve army if they were reliant purely on internal mechanisms of displacement. Interestingly, Marx maybe intuits some of this because the last sections of his chapter 25 talk about both the British agricultural proletariat and most significantly about Ireland. And in that section, all of a sudden Marx expands the horizon of his analysis of British capitalism to think about one of its colonial possessions, Ireland, and the flow of surplus labor from Ireland into Britain as a key part of constituting and reconstituting the working class. And really what I want to suggest, and I'll give a little bit of empirical underpinnings to this, is that insight that Marx has at the end about Britain's relationship to Ireland and the key role of Irish workers in replenishing the industrial reserve army can serve as a paradigm for thinking about primitive accumulation, austerity, displacement, and the reconstitution of the labor market, the working class in the countries of the core. And to give you some sense of how significant these problems are, the UN Population Fund estimates that by 2050, the population of Europe will contract by 125 million without immigration. This is a massive contraction that we're talking about in something under 40 years, to see your population decline by 125 million. Even in cases where birth rates and family sizes are significantly higher, like Canada and the United States, the reliance on immigration is still huge. Take, for instance, the growth of the US population between 2000 and 2010. It was more than half reliant on immigration from Latin America. And without that immigration from Latin America, the Industrial Reserve Army and what those economists that Michael Perlman was talking about like to call the natural rate of unemployment, brackets, the natural rate of unemployment simply means the level of unemployment that allows capital to hold down wages. Okay? And now there's a debate. For a long period of time, the natural rate was considered to be 4%, and that was enough to have a depressive impact on wage growth. Now some economists are saying maybe 6% looks better. Well, of course, once again, we're not dealing with a natural law. We're dealing with a social construction that represents social power, where capital recognizes what level of unemployment it needs to effective accumulation. But the point is, in all of the global north today, without ongoing processes of importing workers who are effectively displaced elsewhere, the natural rate of unemployment, as they like to call it, or what Marx calls the Industrial Reserve Army, would not be sufficient for capital's needs. And this, I suggest, is really the key to thinking through some of what is going on, both in the neoliberal era, but also, of course, particularly with austerity right now. And by the way, I won't be able to get into this in any detail, but in my book, Global Slump, that PM Press has over in the corner, I try to argue that there were several pillars of a neoliberal economic expansion across the 1980s and 90s. And here I dissent from some left economists who believe we've been in a crisis for 40 years. I don't think global capitalism was in a crisis in the 80s and 90s. I think it entered one in 2008, but I don't think there was 4 decades of crisis. And one of the reasons for the restoration of dynamism within capitalism across the neoliberal era was precisely this process of enormous growth in the global reserve army of labor. Obviously, our figures here are pretty much ballpark figures, but if we look at the period since the early 1980s, the best estimates we have is that the global proletariat, that is to say, those who have no other means of reproducing themselves except to sell their labor power, that group globally grew from about 1.5 billion to something a little over 3 billion. In other words, it more than doubled across the neoliberal era. And today, the global reserve army represents about 50% of those 3.25 or so billion people. And what that means, remember from Marx, the global reserve army consists of those who are fully unemployed or those whose employment is extremely precarious, and this would of course include millions and millions of people in the so-called informal sector in both the global south and the global north. Now, with respect to cheap labor, there are really 2 options for capital. Capital can go where labor is cheap, and of course, the very significant growth of foreign direct investment in China, for instance, over the last 30 years, is part of that process of capital going where labor is cheap. But similarly, capital can bring cheap labor to where its work processes are relatively fixed. In other words, those capitalist processes which are highly fixed spatially, agriculture, you can't pick up and move the land. construction, work in a whole variety of service industries, hotels, restaurants, and so on in major cities like this, New York. These are places where capital will try to establish mechanisms then for moving cheap labor into these centers of accumulation. So we see both processes. Some analyses, I think, tend not to see how they form a unity, that capital can both move and capital can also bring labor to it. But this is all the process of what we might describe as the globalization of the labor market. We still have a tendency in a lot of our commentary to treat labor markets as if they're purely national constructions. Whereas in fact, one of the things which is clear about the so-called globalization era is just the increasing integration of flows of labor across national borders. And of course, for the North American economy, Mexico remains an absolute key to the global reserve army. I mean, it's no accident that Mexico comes third in the world in terms of the export of labor, the migration of labor across borders. First comes China, then comes India, then comes Mexico. And I don't think I need to tell you there's a big population jump as you move down, but of course it's got to do with how strategically central Mexican labor and other Latin American labor is to accumulation in North America. In the neoliberal era, I'll suggest, and particularly today in the age of austerity, displaced migrant labor constitutes the ideal precarious worker. In other words, we all know that precariousness, increased insecurity, has become central, crucial, definitional of the neoliberal austerity regime. You make labor more insecure, and there are a whole series of ways of doing that, from busting unions to creating new legal frameworks which make union recognition and strikes more difficult, to actually creating pools of labor that do not have the full set of formal legal political rights that citizen labor has. And of course, this is why we see the paradox particularly sharp in the United States, where the economy becomes increasingly reliant on these flows of labor, and at the same time, these flows of labor across borders are subjected to ever more repressive and draconian systems of regulation and surveillance, militarized systems of surveillance and regulation. And many of you will know better than I do that the current immigration bill working its way through Congress is going to require an ever greater militarization of the Mexican-US border as part of creating a path to citizenship for many undocumented workers in the United States. These two sides of the coin are in a dialectical contradiction, not a logical one. And by that what I mean is that it is not a contradiction for capital to say it wants to militarily police migrant labor, and at the same time it wants to admit it. Because of course what you then do is you admit millions of people into the labor market who lack full legal rights and protections, who are essentially more insecure, more precarious, more unprotected than anyone else. And you can do this either through legal programs or through simply having an acceptance and a tolerance of the economic necessity of undocumented migrant labor. In the Canadian case, with which I'm quite familiar, there is now a program called the Temporary Foreign Worker Program. The number of workers admitted under this program has tripled in the last decade. And these workers are legally deprived. They come in with papers which strip them of all kinds of legal and political rights and allow Canadian employers to pay them 15% less than the wage that they can document for them. So here you're getting precarious labor that's actually nicely documented at the border, but it serves the same function as undocumented labor in France or the United States or what have you. This, by the way, and I won't be able to go into this in any detail, on the other side creates whole new structures by which labor and labor power is being reproduced in those economies which are exporting labor. It creates whole new structures of family and gender relations, the emergence of what some socialist feminist commentators have referred to as transnational motherhood, where women are on the move, sending remittances across borders, and so on. So it's very significant transformations in gender forms, but of course also it is crucial to what is also referred to today as neo-racism. That is to say, the ways in which the migrant worker has become the key target for a whole series of neo-racist parties and practices, very, very widespread in Europe at the moment, whether you're talking about the Golden Dawn Party in Greece or the UK Independence Party in Britain, but of course has also been a Tea Party phenomenon in the United States. Now, I'm running out of time, so I really just want to conclude by way of saying that migrant workers have also been in the forefront of a whole series of highly innovative forms of resistance in recent years. And it's extremely important that in developing practices of working class solidarity with respect to migrant workers, the left doesn't depict migrant workers simply as victims. In fact, from the struggles of the sans-papiers in France, occupying buildings, carrying on demonstrations, winning legalization for thousands and thousands of undocumented workers, to strikes in Italy of migrant workers in recent months and so on, and of course to the migrant and immigrant justice struggles in the United States, migrant workers have shown their capacity to self-organize, to sometimes play very, very important roles in working class and anti-racist movements. And it seems to me that one of the things we need to pay attention to is that if, as I'm suggesting, the constitution of the global reserve army of labor has become more central to the operations of late capitalism in the age of austerity, then organizing for migrant justice and anti-racist working class politics becomes not just something to recognize on May Day, but needs to become really integral and central to all politics of working class resistance today. Thank you.
When Michael asked me to talk here about primitive accumulation, I was under the impression that what we're going to be talking about is the relationship between primitive accumulation and industrial capital accumulation. And my point of the talk is going to be that we've now moved beyond industrial capital accumulation back towards primitive accumulation. Except that whereas the original primitive accumulation is described by Marx and Rosa Luxemburg, was primarily military in the first instance, followed by seizure of the land. Now you have finance achieving what military force used to. Now, Marx described, since the previous speaker described Marx in Capital, what he talked about was the idyllic proceedings of the chief moments of primitive accumulation. And he began fairly late in the story. He didn't begin with the looting of Byzantium in the 13th century that provided Europe with the silver and gold that really fueled the whole growth of banking and commerce. He began with the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, the enslavement and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for commercial hunting among blackskins, signaled the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. And also Rosa Luxemburg followed this. She said militarism fulfills a quite definite function in the history of capital, accompanying it as it does every phase of accumulation. But the whole idea for Marx was that the point of accumulating capital by military looting and then by commerce was supposed to create a stock of capital investment that then was going to be used to employ wage labor to begin producing goods and services at a markup, at a profit. And when Marx said profit, he means basically what we Wall Street analysts call cash flow, or EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. It meant all the surplus over and above the actual cost of production. Now, the way in which the capitalist, industrial capitalism took off was indeed with a dependent labor force, and once you invaded a country, the next thing you had to do was what England's landed aristocracy did, which is take control of the land, and then you drive the labor off that into the cities, where they have no choice but to work for wages, and that's when you have the wage labor turning into the source of profits. And so the idea of industrial capital to Marx was to employ labor to produce goods and services to sell at a markup, which is profit or cash flow. That's obviously not what we're seeing today. The question that I think we should all describe is, how did we go from this system that was pretty optimistic in Marx's description? Finally, okay, we're not in the looting phase anymore. Now we're in the domestic phase. How do we get to a capital accumulation that was supposed to be a driving process? How do we end up to today's austerity programs over the whole world and the economic shrinkage? When it comes to population, I want to say one thing about James Stewart that Michael Perlman mentioned. James Stewart wrote Principles of Political Economy. That was also the title of David Ricardo's book, Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. It was the title of John Stuart Mill's book, Principles of Political Economy, with some of their applications to social problems. And the only exception to calling a major book Principles of Political Economy was by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. And he didn't want to call his book Principles of Political Economy because his publisher was James Stewart's publisher. He didn't want the same title as James Stewart. He wanted to really drive James Stewart out of business. That was his task, and Marx goes into this quite a bit in his Theories of Surplus Value. And the first translator, Terence McCarthy, who translated this as History of Economic Doctrines, had in his introduction a discussion about how Smith was to replace Stewart there. And Stewart was characterized as a mercantilist, and it was Smith who used this, but they were really political arithmeticians. Stewart was the last great monetary theorist before Smith, integrating finance into the industrial capitalist process. And I think it's very important to read Stewart. I bought my copy of his Principles of Political Economy 50 years ago in a copy that was photocopied or made by photography in Japan and bound to look like the original edition of Stewart, which was actually rarer than the Stewart's book itself. Well, anyway, the whole point of capital accumulation is to be in a position to employ labor, to produce manufactures, to sell at a profit. Accumulation was seizing the land to produce. There was some discussion about the role of technology in how is that going to displace labor as capitalists continue to find machinery to produce cheaper than labor. Isn't this going to disemploy labor? And you find a lot of discussion on the left today. In book 2 of Marx's Theories of Surplus Value, he discusses Ricardo, and he showed how a permanent crisis was impossible under capitalism for technology, because he says the more rapid the rate of technological improvement, the faster existing physical capital becomes obsolete, and you're going to have an increasing employment of labor in Department 2 in the capital goods industries to make the new capital that will displace the old capital. So Marx rejected the idea of technology as leading to unemployed labor. What is happening today is quite different. You mentioned the role of population. I want to say one thing in. You have essentially in neoliberalism a financial plan of takeover. You now no longer have to conquer a country militarily to take over its land or to take over the public sector. Most of the fortunes of wealth, as the French novelists noticed, such as Zola and the others, were by seizing the fortune from the public domain. Almost all the great fortunes, including the railroad fortunes that Michael has talked about, were taken from the public domain. They were that was their form of primitive accumulation. If you want to see primitive accumulation in the modern world, just look at what the European Troika is doing to Greece. It said, you owe the money, you have to pay the debts, sell off your land, sell off the Acropolis, sell off the island, sell off your tourist sites, and especially the oil rights in the Aegean and Mediterranean. That's what they're after. You also mentioned the precarious worker. The phrase used by Alan Greenspan's biographer was the traumatized worker. Alan Greenspan explained to Congress, first of all, he was an aficionado of pension fund capitalism, of saving. Alan Greenspan said in his two testimonies before the Senate Banking Committee that since 1980, the whole recovery of the American economy has been marked by the fact that wages haven't gone up at all since the late 70s. And how is this? And Alan Greenspan said, it's brilliant. The workers have all gone so deeply into debt to buy their houses that if they go on strike or if they're fired from their jobs, all of a sudden they'll miss a mortgage payment. They'll be three mortgage payments away from homelessness. Not only that, but now that they're forced to increase their standard of living by going into debt, by taking out the second mortgages that Greenspan was encouraging them to do, to take out the equity in their houses by going into debt, and by living off their credit cards. If they miss a telephone payment or a credit card payment or any monthly payment, their credit card rates of interest go up to 29%. So the workers can't afford to complain anymore. They can't afford to take a risk. And so you have what was called the traumatized worker effect in here. And the great, what finance capitalism has discovered since you have the pension fund capitalism in the 1950s is there's another way of exploiting workers. The financial sector realizes that it's much easier to exploit workers not by employing them. If you employ workers, you have to go to all the trouble of producing things. You have to develop new markets. You have to invest in machinery. You have to employ advertising to promote the goods. It's much easier to simply exploit them financially. First of all, you have them contribute to a pension fund, and the company contributes to a pension fund, which can be done in two ways. Either it's turned over to the financial sector to manage, usually in corporate rating to downsize the labor force, or it's an employee stock ownership program, such as the Chicago Tribune had. 50% of the employee stock ownership programs already at the time the pension fund capitalism started, were bankrupt. You saw in the Chicago Tribune when Sam Zell bought the Tribune, he borrowed the money against the stock that the workers had. Then he drove the Tribune bankrupt. That wiped out the pensions. This is the strategy now. In a way, it's what the Russians call grabbitization. It's easier, cheaper to grab sources and sums of financial capital than it is to actually loot the gold and silver, where you actually had to employ workers to dig out the gold and silver in the mines of Latin America and Africa and the other places. So finance has become the new mode of achieving what it used to take an army to do. Putin in Russia said that privatization and financialization of the Russian economy since 1991, and especially under Yeltsin's after 1994, had destroyed more Russian population than the 22 million Russians who died in World War II. So you have the effect of privatization everywhere that it's extended as shrinking the population. In the country that I specialize in, Latvia, Latvia has lost 20% of its population through emigration since the neoliberals really imposed their program after the year 2000. It was at the time of independence from Russia in 1991, Latvia had 2.2 million population. The current official number is 2 million if you count all the visitors to Latvia, all the Latvian visitors, all the foreigners who own the land, and demographers say that it's now 1.8 million. That's the equivalent of 40%. But even if you take the numbers that the government reports, 20%, you would have to have, in America, which is now being held out, if only you could be like Latvia. Follow the Latvian model. That's what the Greeks were told, the Americans are told. 50 million Americans will have to emigrate in the next 10 years in order to duplicate the Latvian model. I don't think there are enough courses teaching Chinese to enable them to find jobs abroad for all of this. So, you know, that's really the problem. You're having exactly the opposite. We are now in the shrinkage part of capitalism, and the fact is, Marx did not call primitive accumulation capitalism. He called it just plain looting. The neoliberals call it privatization. The Russians call it grabbitization. But it's all basically the same thing. It does not involve money being invested in commodity production turning into more money. It's making money off money. And as long as you can get other countries to agree not to oppose, just cancel their foreign debts and annul them, like the U.S. states did in the early 19th century, then you have a voluntary payment of the foreign debts by means of just turning the property over. And on the right wing of the spectrum throughout Europe, you have the Marxist parties, or the parties that begin as the Marxist parties. The right wing throughout the world now are the Social Democrats, the Labor Party, and the Democratic Party in the United States. These are the parties that are supporting the bankers, as if somehow supporting the bankers is supporting what is going to finance industrial capitalism. But the banking sector, the finance capitalism, is not financing industrial capitalism. Marx had believed that the natural technological way of capitalism to develop would be that finally the role of industrial capitalism was to liberate Europe from feudalism. It was going to get rid of the landlords, it was going to get rid of the bankers and take them into the state, and the effective democracy was going to be to enable labor to get the vote, and labor would act in its self-interest. Somehow you have the labor parties and the labor unions throughout the world acting diametrically against the interests of labor by supporting the banks, so that in Greece it was the leader of the Social Democrats, the party, the Socialist Party there, who at the time was the head of the Socialist International. Papandreou, who agreed with the European Union, yes, we're going to privatize, and he said, we should have a vote. Angela Merkel said, no, you can't have a vote. They'll vote against it. So Papandreou said, you're absolutely right. We're the Socialist Party. We don't let the people vote. His popularity rating fell to 8%, and thank God the socialists were thrown out of power. They were being thrown out of power in almost every European country, especially in the other country I'm involved in, Iceland, where the socialists and the Social Democratic Party were the only party in Iceland supporting Gordon Brown in England, saying, you Icelanders have to pay for all of the branches that lost money in England because of my light touch, because they lost money, and even though you're not legally obliged to pay, even though we British are obliged to pay, you Icelanders have to agree to pay because otherwise I'll be embarrassed. The socialists were all in favor of paying. And it was the socialists in Iceland that are insisting that the banks index their mortgages to the exchange rate so that the banks won't lose any money, because the labor unions in Iceland are heavy holders of the bank stock. And he said the interests of labor is supporting the pension funds of labor, even if that means cutting employment by 90%. So that's the Social Democratic Party you have in Europe. Now, the political question is, how are we, as Marxists, going to fight against the Social Democrats and the Labour parties throughout the world?
David McNally has a stack of books for sale back there. Can you hear me? No. You tell him that.
Michael's just re-advertising the PM Press stack of books, which includes a few to which I've contributed.
Questions, comments, fruit to throw, whatever? Yes.
Yeah, I didn't hear any discussion of China, and I was interested in knowing about the role that China played in the primitive accumulation.
Are either of you a professor in China? Since I'm a professor in China, I get to...
Why don't we take a few
A few questions, okay.
The role of primitive accumulation in the China story, especially the increase in the wage working force worldwide. You mentioned 3 billion doubling. How much is that is China? And what is this dismantling of the demand economy, part of the primitive accumulation story in the form of the Soviet Union with self-representation, but in China, it's very different.
We should make, I think there are a lot of questions. We should make it brief.
Could you explain what happened in Iceland then? Talk a little bit about what happened in Iceland.
Okay.
I actually am a professor of labor studies in China. So I've lived there for half of each year for the last 10 years, and I would be delighted to talk about that, but also ask for some deeper analysis from some of the Marxist experts here.
I got a question about semantics. Why are we still with primitive accumulation instead of Harvey's phrase, accumulation by dispossession? Just insofar as, if I remember my Harvey correctly, he coins that phrase because he wants us to understand that this dispossession is in effect an ongoing characteristic of capitalism, and not just what Marx talked about as sort of the secret to the original concentration, the transition from feudalism to capitalism. The other chime in on China. I'd like to hear a little more from David or any of you about, yes, we have this 3 billion global reserve of army, but what is it about particularly about China? Is it something with regard to education, the role of the state, the role of the Chinese Revolution, that has made it, particularly the zone of accumulation, that did pull, I agree with David, pull capital out of its crisis in the 70s. My China, yeah.
I'm only an amateur economist, but what I wonder about any kind of accumulation is how do we reverse the trend of corporations sucking the economic resources out of our economies and then hiding from taxes. Of course, they use all kinds of globalization shell games. And it seems as though they're more powerful than governments. And it's become this horrendous monster, and then austerity is is the antidote which kills us.
Yeah, I think it's, obviously resonates to talk about the land grabs and so on, is harkening back to what Marx was talking about, primitive accumulation. But I'm wondering if it's appropriate to use that framework to talk about something like grabbing pensions and privatization, because in one sense, this was all a product of a balance of forces in the class struggle internationally after World War II, in which social democracy resurged as discredited capitalists in Europe, and then the New Deal in the United States, which was tolerated for some generations, but once that balance shifts, yes, let's grab everything. And it's also part of, I think about it through accumulation, we're lowering the social wage, we're lowering compensation generally, we're trying to reindustrialize the economy on the basis of a low wage, low social wage, and cheap energy. Is that the same as primitive accumulation? It's an attempt to deal with a changing balance of power in the capital system internationally with China and other new industrializing countries. So does that, I'm just wondering if we're while it's correct to use primitive accumulation to talk about some of this ways it's driven forward, is that really appropriate are we overgeneralizing it?
We should begin to answer pretty soon and take waves of things.
Yeah.
There should be, at a certain point, you should have one group of questions.
Ruth, and then-
Yeah. Okay. I was wondering what people see as the limits of this new way of doing things. I mean, obviously, like running out of markets is one, or labor rebellion is another. I'm just wondering how far you're seeing capitalists can go on with this. And the other half of that question is, what is happening to the capitalist class? I mean, it seems like the poorer capitalists must be dropping out of this whole thing. Because of the consolidation.
You answer for, let's answer.
Yes.
You.
Let's try some answers. I have a few short remarks. One is, about 25 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, about 20 years ago, I was at a meeting of the Western Economics Association, and I heard a familiar voice behind me, and I recognized it right away. And it was Milton Friedman, who was gloating about 100 million unemployed workers in China and how they'll just trash the union movement in the United States. How he was just jumping up and down with all 5'3" or whatever he is. Fortunately, he's not jumping anymore. In terms of the word primitive accumulation, its origin is so nice that I'm attracted to it. I should have talked about the origin in my talk. It's very quickly this. Adam Smith talked about original accumulation. That's where did it come from? And it was like he was looking for the big bang of capitalism. And he never answered. Marx quoted this in Capital, and it was translated back into English from the German as primitive, to get a sense of the barbarism of it. And that's where primitive accumulation comes from. He then quoted Robert Torrens, another major British economist, and a colonel also, who said it happened when the first person picked up a tool and made it. And Marx then played with this word of shtick and stock and said, the first man picks up stock and it's a stick, and that's the origin of his discussion of primitive accumulation. It's such a nice story. In terms of where capitalism is going, I wanted to title one of my books, Down the Tubes on the Haitian Road to Development. Meaning, what we're trying to do is what Ruth is suggesting, trying to kind of compete with Haiti and the other low-wage countries in order to revitalize capitalism, as if that's where to go. Now, it's very interesting. I did not talk about, a major part of my talk was going to be about the American economists who were trained in Germany, who were respectful of Marx, didn't like his politics, but respectful of his economics. And they had a very different take, and they started talking about the economy of high wages. And this was accepted in United States economics until around the middle of the Hoover administration. Hoover still He said the way to improve the economy is to have high wages, which forces companies to industrialize. Of course, this doesn't work when you have an open economy. And then I really should let our other panelists. Okay. As a professor in China, you have.
Marx described governments as the board of directors of the capitalist class. But today, central banks are the boards of directors, not of the industrial capitalist class, but of the financial class. And when you have the European Troika doing what it's doing in Greece and the others, it's acting on behalf of the banks, not the industrialists. And I think that's how in China, the central bank isn't running things. As it happened, Milton Friedman was invited to the Shanghai about 40 years ago. And so what you have in China is a kind of unique formulation of Thatcherite Marxists. For instance, just let's look at history. As you know, China is only 30 years old. It didn't exist as a country before there. All of a sudden, it was just invented, and all the stuff that you see has only been built in the last 30 years. It was a desert before there, nothing was built. That's the story you get whenever you visit China. Look what we've done. Nobody mentions Mao except in Beijing and further off in the West. And it's just amazing how it is as if they didn't see that in between the old imperialist control of China and what they've done now, Thatcherite Marxism, you had the Mao clean the slate. And if you read Mao's earlier workings, one of the big discussions they had is, what are you going to do with the excess workers that Mao called the lumpen proletariat? He said, what are you going to do with the fact that all over China you have beggars? And he said, you can't look at them as they're not the vanguard of the working class, certainly. There's nothing really you can do. But if you look at any of the images of how China was under Chiang Kai-shek, under the others, all you see is poverty anymore. You don't see that at all anymore. And yet you had this Maoist interregnum that entailed the famine, that entailed the force, but it was all under something I don't think that you can call what happened in Russia state capitalism really, but you can call what happened in China state capitalism, when the state really decided how to develop industry and how to develop what actually is the largest sector in any economy, and that's real estate. If you're talking about capital accumulation and you're looking at statistics, you've got to look at the actual statistics. Most of the capital is invested in buildings, and of course in the public infrastructure. That's what they did in China. They built the real capital that a society needs, the infrastructure, the buildings. Russia for some reason, was never able to have a construction industry. Just go to Russia or any of the satellites, especially in East Germany, the buildings are physically falling down. Nobody is ever going to want to pay more money for a pre-war building, in the Soviet Union or in Germany or the Baltics than as they would here in New York. They couldn't do it. In China, the building is much better. So all of a sudden, you had the state planning the industry, working at admittedly low wages, because why are they low? If you have an American budget, most of the money goes for rent, for housing, and for finance. In China, they didn't have the high real estate. They didn't have the high housing costs. Although they had low wages, their wages were paid thoroughly on the goods and services, and they could afford them. So China could afford to undersell. Now there's a whole transformation. The whole issue before the current regime that's coming to power in China is now it's time where Europe is dead. America's turning into a dead zone. We have to depend on the internal market. Now they're going to raise the wages, and for the first time, you're going to have an internal market. The only problem is how do you prevent people from wasting their money on cars and pollution, and you can't imitate the consumer program patterns that you have in the West because just of the pollution and the traffic jams you have. But the whole idea is now you're having the transition to a high-wage economy in China, basically.
Okay, I'll try to be brief, but maybe also pull out some of the differences of emphasis among us on the panel. The heart of my argument was to insist that wage labor remains central to the workings of the global economy today. And my response to Michael's formulation earlier that we've shifted to financial exploitation of workers is to say, to financially exploit workers, they first have to have wages. Otherwise, what are you going to be able to exploit them for? In other words, I agree there are new modalities of financial appropriation. There's no question about that. But not only are there workers with wages, but the trend of the neoliberal period, as I was trying to highlight, has been an enormous expansion in the global working class. And the thing I would emphasize about China is that you are talking, for instance, about thousands and thousands of factories that did not exist 20 or 25 years ago. Some of them utterly massive complexes of tens of thousands of workers working in integrated production facilities. I mean, China has not simply been through, but it has been through this enormous real estate and building boom. It has been through the most compressed industrial revolution in human history. The process of industrialization has been much more rapid, dramatic, and compressed. I mean, you're talking than in, say, Britain. You're talking about some hundreds of millions of people who have moved from the land into urban wage labor. Many of these are as migrants. That is to say, they don't have the full legal rights in the cities. They are internal migrant laborers who still belong to their villages. And this gives them a second-class sort of status internally, which is why migrant labor figures so powerfully. Something in the area maybe of 200 to 250 million people who constitute the internal migrant labor force in China today. And that, Paul, in terms of your question, that's why I want to keep on Marx's term of primitive accumulation. My worry is that in the discussion, there's been a tendency, and of course this was part of the debate around David Harvey's book that took place in the journal Historical Materialism, where some people said it's been equated with looting and predatory practices. And I think the question from Lee here earlier was getting at this too, that if we simply equate accumulation by dispossession with looting, we forget the other side of Marx's argument, which is he says the essence of the process is the separation of direct producers from the land. They're pushed onto the labor market and their transformation into wage laborers or part of the global reserve army. And I see that process as still central to the workings of global capitalism today. And that's why, like a number of commentators, I'm quite taken by those places where Marx says primitive accumulation kickstarts capital accumulation and then is reproduced as internal to and integral to capital accumulation. He says there's multiple places across capital, and I agree with that. And so it's one of the reasons why I like to keep that term. And finally, on the question, what are the limits of this current mode of accumulation? I can't do any justice, but it's a great question, Ruth. But I would say this. I believe the evidence is overwhelming that the recovery of profitability since about 2009, particularly in the United States, has been driven by increased rate of exploitation of labor. Put simply, workers have been rendered more productive while their wages have been effectively stagnant. That's driving up the rate of exploitation. But Marx tells us that to exit a period of crisis, capital needs not only to restore profitability by more effective exploitation of labor, but also to destroy existing capital and replace it by revolutionizing the means of production. That is to say, it needs a new investment boom, a new wave of accumulation that gets rid of the least profitable capitals and allows another cycle of accumulation to take off. I believe that has not happened in any significant sense. One of the reasons for that, by the way, is because marginal capitals can stay alive so long as interest rates are zero. I mean, basically, as long as you can just get the money, you can keep your cash flow going. And so we're in this funny period of high unemployment, profits have rebounded, but there's no new wave of investment. Unemployment stays very, very high, especially for the young, and I think that's going to be a real limit, and we're seeing it from Taksim Square to everywhere right now, those youth rebellions against this moment.
One quick comment, then we'll have more questions. And that is the depression in the 1870s that I talked about. The depression in the 1870s was created because of the rapid destruction of capital. At one point, Andrew Carnegie shut down a factory that had been in operation for only 2 months. Leveled it because he heard of a better technology. The problem with it, and Marx is clear about this, is that you have to have the capital working for enough time to be able to pay for itself. Otherwise, the rapid reindustrialization or destruction of capital is so fast that it cannibalizes the economy. So it becomes unsustainable. Unsustainable. Okay, now question.
Thank you. Thanks for a fascinating panel, and I'm also interested in the tensions between the various speakers. So I have a couple of questions. My question for David. David, I mean, I think that chapter 25 is absolutely fascinating. And it's called the general law of capital accumulation, and I think it is a mark of the deep humanism of Marx, that the general law of capital accumulation is directly connected with the law of population. And I think that that's a brilliant thing, but I think that Marx was much more social than you're giving him credit for. Because I think that there are senses, I mean, you talk about Ireland, but also within England, there's a sense in which Marx is saying that people who are forced to reproduce themselves at very low levels of technology and productivity have more children. And this is, in a sense, what's happening also at the global scale, so I'd like your comments on that. I also like your comments, secondly, on the argument that Hurst Thompson originally made, and now in Hurst Thompson and Bromley, that the levels of migration up to 1914 as a proportion of the world population were much greater than they have been since. And of course, in one sense, when you talk about the rise of remittances, I mean, that's actually, you only get remittances when you get temporary migration. If I take my kid in Kabul and all my kids, I'm not going to send any remittances to anybody. So I think that's a very important part of the problem. And then I have a question, this very specific one for Michael, because it's a very empirical one. What proportion of working class people do you think in the United States were actually the recipients of mortgages and in general and of subprime mortgages in particular? Because I mean, I just want to know the answer to that. Because I sometimes think that the trade-off between wages and credit is exaggerated in the last decade in the United States, but I could be wrong. And then finally, two quick points for everybody. Number one, I would have thought that when we talk about primitive accumulation, we talk about land. And in this respect, I want your comments on the causes of the recent food price increases and the relationship to peasant agriculture and so on. And none of you talked about the service sector. I agree with you, we're still living in a liberal economy, but everybody talks about manufacturing. I want to talk about services.
Just on the mortgages, 20% of mortgages were subprime. And some of these
That's not my question.
Well, no, I'm getting to that. Some of the mortgages that went bad were given to poor people who owned their houses outright, and then the house was overvalued, and the second mortgage was put on, and they defaulted on that. So there was sort of a taking going on there. My question is just really narrow, and that is the AFL-CIO, I think it is, supporting the immigration bill. And their reasoning appears to be that if there's more immigration, that they could unionize the migrants. Is that making the wrong bet?
I have a question which I see as another mechanism of accumulation. That is the difference between the official inflation rate that the government declares and the actual inflation rate, and the amount of interest that's paid on savings. So a bank can get assets, and next year get much more for their assets in terms of the currency, and the official accumulation rate is 1% or whatever they're paying on, and the government's official rate of inflation, which is much undervalued in regard to the true rate of inflation.
I have a question for Michael. Let's talk a little bit about quantitative easing programs and the role in.
Just speak louder.
You could talk about quantitative easing programs and the role in accumulation.
Yeah, just in regards to this, the idea that the only way to exit from a deep crisis is to destroy a lot of capital. It always seems to me that it's not just political, a superstructural political issue, so to speak, that have to drive to war, but that war is itself an economic necessity at a certain point in the logic of the development of capital. And in the situation we have right now, you need a big war, because you need to destroy some serious capital.
Like, we're almost at the end of questions, so it's going to take us till the end of the time to answer all these.
Okay. One question, I'll just talk about the question about the rate of inflation and the rate of accumulation, because we really don't have a good understanding. If you take an idea and you create it as intellectual, you call it intellectual property, then you can escalate the price, and that gives the illusion of increasing productivity, where it's just a bookkeeping question, not really productivity. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So there are all sorts of things that count as productivity. The productivity of bankers who are speculating on derivatives will count as productivity. We do not have good understanding of what's going on in terms of productivity in the economy. I do want to say one other thing about China. Is, from my understanding of my time there, and I'd like to get your comment as one of the discussions about it, that they're trying to upgrade the migrant workers and trying to raise wages to force themselves up the value chain to allow them to be more competitive in the economy.
If I were giving a theoretical explanation, which I didn't have time for, I would have talked about the theory of economic rent. Accumulation is supposed to be out of profits, and what we're seeing today is rent extraction, not productive profits. That's what we're going to be talking about at 3:40 in the same room. But I want to talk about, address the quantitative easing, because that really is the means of accumulation today. The Federal Reserve can create an infinite amount of money that it lends to banks at 1/4 of 1 percentage point. The banks can then borrow at 1/4 and buy every bond in the world, every factory in the world, every corporation in the world, every bit of land in the world that yields more than 1/4%. So they can do all this until you get the entire economic surplus being paid as interest, and it's all absorbed in interest. The question is, how far can this go? That was one of the questions. We know how far it can go because we have a perfect scale model before us, the Roman Empire. Everything in the Roman Empire was turned into a payment of interest. All the major historians, Livy, Diodorus, Plutarch, all said it was the creditors who took over. All of the surplus in land and commerce was pledged for credit. The result was the Dark Age. Population fell even more than it did in Latvia. Even more immigrants than you had from Iceland. You have a whole shrinkage of this. So the answer is that once you have the entire economic surplus paid as interest, then the whole system collapses. And that's the tendency of primitive accumulation. Asset stripping and looting is short-term. The finance capital has always been short-term. Marx expected finance capital to become long-term and to be integrated with the profit-seeking process, but instead finance capital in the United States and Europe has integrated with real estate in the fire sector, finance, insurance, and real estate, and the monopolies And so you have, the financial process has become part of the asset stripping process and primitive accumulation, not industrial accumulation, as Marx had hoped.
Wow, what an amazing discussion period. I will not do justice to all of the points that were raised, but in sort of some quick telegraphic order, beginning, Radhika, with your comments. I think Marx is naturalistic when he assumes that there's no issue around the rate of population growth. But I think you're right that when he enters into more micro reflections, there's a lot of very interesting subtlety in there that we can build on. And really that's what I was trying to do with the Ireland part of the discussion. I really agree with what you say about services. We have a tendency to assume that when we talk about labor in the service sector, it's not industrial. And yet, when I walk into a McDonald's, and I have children, which is why I have to sometimes walk into a McDonald's, I must tell you, what I see with the production of a Big Mac is assembly line production. You know, that's what it looks like to me. And the fact that it's not a huge industrial complex, but there's maybe 8-10 people working behind that counter with a very clear division of labor. They've all been task-timed, and so on. To me, a lot of what we describe as services is really industrial labor that is simply often just meant for personal consumption rather than purposes of accumulation. Two other points. War is clearly a mechanism of enormous destruction of capital, and I don't think one can ever discount it as such a mechanism. I think the truth is that absent a hugely destructive war and absent a hugely destructive depression, and for all kinds of reasons, I think central banks are highly allergic to the direction of a massively destructive global depression right now, basically because they think the financial system will collapse the way that it began to in 08, 09. They have a dilemma. You know, there are at least 50 unnecessary auto plants in the world. Okay? There are 50 plants that should be closed, destroyed. We're talking of several 100 million tons of excess steel capacity in the world today. In order to revitalize capitalism, all of these factories, steel mills, and so on would have to close so that then there could be a new investment boom by those who remain to essentially struggle over the world market. In the absence of that, and I think we're going to see the absence of that for quite some considerable period of time, we're talking about a long stretched out new normal with much higher rates of unemployment, particularly for young people, with an ongoing austerity war against social programs, minimum wages, unions, and so on. And we've already, we've been in this 5 years now. I mean, I remember the first Left Forum in 2008 where we first started to talk about this because Bear Stearns had just collapsed while the Left Forum was meeting 5 years ago. And, we're now 5 years into this. I think we'll be having this conversation in 5 years' time because I see the whole thing is stretched out. And this new normal, I think one of the key limits, going back to my comment earlier on Ruth's comment, is I don't believe that 64% youth unemployment in Greece is sustainable. I don't believe that 50% plus youth unemployment in Spain is sustainable, politically sustainable. Never mind the economic dynamics of it. And it's why I think that we're seeing, if you will, a convergence of political revolts which are simultaneously generational. That is to say, there's a youth dynamic to them, if you look who's in Taksim Square right now. But also, it's about precarious labor. These young people are not just students, although they may be students. This intersection of youth and precarious labor today means that we're seeing certain sections of the working class that are rebelling around all kinds of conditions of life and labor. And Michael mentioned our recent trip to Slovenia, and I'll conclude on this. This is who we saw across the Balkans. We saw the young generation from Slovenia and Serbia and Croatia. And by the way, while we were there, they launched in Slovenia the first new left movement since the Civil War. It's called the Initiative for Democratic Socialism. And it's coming out of precisely this layer of young people. And I think really what we're talking about is also the question of, can a new left based on these young activists be constituted in the next period of time, which will regenerate the left internationally? Thank you.
Why no collapse? Why stretching out?
Because